I'm W.L. Bill Barrett, and I was president of the association in 1963. That's 55 years ago. We only had a small council back in those days. I think about 3 from St. John, 2 from Fredericton. And we used to drive down about once a month, and they gave me a chance to get away from the office. And a change, they say, is as good as the rest. I was city engineer at the time. I'd been there for 10 years and taken all the crap. And there's only one place to be city engineer is Fredericton. Whenever I got hard going in Fredericton, I'd take a drive to St. John, I'd come back, and I'd be all ready for another year or so. I'll tell you one thing, after I retired, I never complained about anything, because I took enough complaints when I was working without complaining about anything. Everything was in St. John. Power Commission, headquarters for the professional engineers, and anything else big was in St. John until J.L. Feeney bought Power Commission up. Then everything started to move up into Fredericton, where it should have been in the first place. Well, back in those days, EIC was very active. They were looking after the engineers, and the association was looking after professional engineers. And you didn't have to be a professional engineer unless you signed your name to some document. So any time we had a dinner once a year, we'd be invited by the EIC in St. John, always in St. John, to attend the dinner. And maybe be 25 engineers, professional engineers that is, attend the dinner, and the rest of them would be all members of the EIC. Well, we were all members of the EIC back in those days. That is the Engineering Institute of Canada. I don't know if they even exist today. Well, we had a female secretary who couldn't take shorthand, but she was a good worker, and she looked after things. Our office, by the way, was in the old CPR station, which is now Harbour Station. Little wee office, and we'd get down there once a month. And in '63, of course, we appointed our first, you couldn't call him a manager, but at first, he wasn't an engineer. He was from Nova Scotia. We advertised him, and we were only able to get one man. And I guess his name is, I was asking Andrew not long ago what his name was, at Carew. And he lasted there about 2 years until Don Forbes took over 2 years later in '65. And Don was an engineer, of course, a professional engineer, and he changed things around and started building and building and building up the association so that you could have a few members more than what they had the year before. Well, I know that at one of the dinners we had, I ate all the entree, which was lobster. I didn't have any main meal at all. I had lobster. And St. John, of course, the old Admiral Beatty, they could really later on. That's one of the happier moments of meeting down there. But I enjoyed going down because I meet different fellows, and we talk about different things that involved engineering, both from a highway type of thing, like Bob Lynch, who was a counselor at one point in time. We used to drive down together, and Al Stevens, who was a professor at the university, we'd drive down together once a month, and it was a good experience. And as I said before, you know, a change as good as the rest. Well, back in those days, they used to send out ballots for elections, and if the president was on the ballot, then there'd be so many opposed to him, or at least not the president, but there'd be a position for the ballot for the president on the ballot, and there'd be a nomination from maybe 2 or 3, so they'd take a selection, and we'd have to take all those into consideration and come up with answers to who won what, and the councilors the same way. There are always nominations of at least 2 in each district. As I say, Howie McFarland and myself were appointed scrutineers, and I think Howie and I had it for about 15 years before he died. And then I got my good friend John Mossman, who was no longer with us. He was there for quite a little while too, until the computers came in, and then we both get out of it. I think one year we had a return I think we made a mistake of some kind or other. Maybe we had a tie or something. Somebody challenged it, and the fellow that challenged it actually was the fellow that won the election. But that's, you win some, you lose some. Well, I'll tell you the fact that we appointed the first executive director, shall we call him. That is not the title that I would have given him at that time, but that is the title that they talk about today. Oh, well, we just hired him as a fellow that would go out and see if he couldn't find some more professional engineers to pay into the association and get the association increased in numbers, so that we could get more counselors, and it's worked out pretty good over the years. In fact, it worked out very good over the years. By the way, his salary for the year was $3,000 back in 1963 and 64. But money didn't mean too much back in those days. You'd get so much home to the wife, and she'd look after groceries and insurance, one thing and another, and maybe you'd stop off at the curling rink and have a couple of drinks and take home a couple of lobster sandwiches. And that's one of the good things about back in those days. There was a curling rink right handy, whereas today it's up the road a ways. And engineers are always involved, aren't they? Hey, they should be if they're not. You talk about volunteers. Well, if somebody called me to do something, engineering-wise, I'd have to have an awful good excuse to say no. It's a part of the system, being a professional engineer, as I see it. Now, some people may argue about that, but I don't know that I ever refused to either count ballots or do anything else that they asked me to do that I was capable of doing. That's another thing that I would put a poke in for, is that we should have more engineers running for council and community organizations. For instance, when I was city engineer, I had 3 different engineers in council at different times. First one was Horace Houston. He was a civil engineer. The next one was Charlie Wayman. He was a civil engineer. And the next one, although he wasn't, they were both my chairman at different times. The next one, although he wasn't my chairman, he was an electrical engineer, and poor buggers, he's dead now, but he was a little different. He hadn't have the courtesy to ask me a question before a council meeting. He'd like to ask at a council meeting, so he'd get me embarrassed, and he'd get, oh, boys, that fellow's smart, asking that city engineer this question. John Bliss, he was city councilor too for a while, but John never became my chairman for some reason or other. He said he did. He was quiet, and I didn't notice it. Well, why change it? If it's working, hold fast. What would the other body do that the self-regulation body's not doing? I have not been occasioned to being any other way, so I can't really tell you what the difference would be. But if it's not regulated, then if it becomes irregular, which is just no action whatsoever, and no progress or anything else. Somebody says, I was 58. Somebody said to me, what are you retiring so young for? I said, when the trademarks of the bricks start to show on your forehead, get out. Oh, it's changed tremendously. I'd say, you mean as far as the city's concerned?
Yeah.
Well, they have a different setup now. They have an administrator, and they have an assistant administrator, and they have what they call it. They don't have a city engineer anymore. They have a public works there now, and he didn't last very long. He just went up as a second in charge of administration. Murray just retired last February. I think when you interview the next fellow, he'll be more modern than what I was, because I was born back in, or at least operating back in the old fashioned way. But John, when he started, he brought in a little different approach to it all, because he was he had a background, a different background to what I had. I simply had a background coming out of college, going to work as an assistant city engineer, being worked into the position of city engineer about 3 years' time when the present city engineer at that time retired. Well, it just happened that that city engineer that I had that hired me went to the hospital to get a gallbladder removed in February of '53. He didn't call a nurse to use the blood pan. He got up to go to the bathroom himself and had a massive heart attack and died right there. So there was I. The assistant engineer at that time was an electrical engineer who graduated in '27, and he didn't want the job. So I was about 7 years older than the rest of these engineers that were in college at the time because of my war experience. And I jumped in and I said, boys, will you support me if I get to be city engineer? And they said, certainly. So I ran around, and there again comes into the professional end of it. Joe Lamb of Sussex, like it was back in those days, was registrar. And I went around with my papers to the Dean of Engineering, Turner, and some more of them, and got signatures on. 4 weeks' time, I was a professional engineer. So I was ready to take over the city of Président. And the first year that I was there, the taxes were the highest they'd ever had because there hadn't been anything done for years. They just penny pinchers all the time. So we started to spend some money and improve things in the streets and one another. Oh, a little bit of respect and just satisfaction of my own mind. You know, if I've contributed something, well, maybe someday if the good Lord up there takes me, there may be some kind of a write-up in the paper about he was doing so and so and so. And they say, the public would say, where'd that fellow get time to do that?